and welcome all. My name is Reverend Mary Katherine Morn. I'm the President and Lead Executive Officer of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and it's really a pleasure to be with you. I just arrived this morning from Massachusetts, catching the very tail end of the CSW, but I've been watching and grateful for the engagement of so many of you in this important work, and really glad to bring this topic to our attention and to invite us together in conversation around gender justice from a faith perspective. Progressive faith has something to say about gender justice. Am I right? Yes. Our event today is sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. That's the organization I represent. Faith and Democracy, the Dahlin Fund, and American Jewish World Service. And we're grateful for all of this support. Faith has something to say about gender justice because our faith, though wildly diverse in the expressions, the beliefs, and the practices, our faith shares a commitment, I'm going to be so bold as to say, in the dignity of every life and the worth of every person. And with this as a fundamental belief, we can do nothing less but work for the advancement of human rights for all. And another aspect of progressive faith that is so important to me is the way that love is a value that is cherished and should be advanced in whatever form it takes. And that love, though many actors wish to legislate and narrowly define both what love means and how love should be practiced, also what gender means and how gender should be lived in our world. We're here to say that each child, some of us might say, is a child of God and precious in God's sight. So it's so great to be in this conversation with all of you at a time when other faith movements are advancing hateful, divisive, and deeply harmful ideologies around gender and gender ideas of gender and the rights of women and bodily autonomy. The through line of all of these efforts on the right isn't just social conservatism. It's actually the systematic legal and cultural elimination of any arrangement, identity, relationship, institution, or norm that challenges the authority of cisgender heterosexual men over women, children, and public life. Maybe you've read Judith Butler, who beautifully puts it. She says it's the patriarchal restoration project. That encapsulates the anti-gender agenda really well, I think. We've seen the success of this movement here in the last 2 weeks in efforts from the United States to bring regressive policies into the conversation. We're grateful that these efforts did not succeed, even though this is the first time at CSW that the commitments that open CSW had to be voted on. The regressive amendments that the United States brought were defeated soundly. And for this, we give thanks, but we know that effort, that energy is strong, and we're here to pay attention and to come together with our own statements and our own commitments related to how faith can advance justice, and particularly gender justice. Today, we're going to hear from an incredible panel of advocates, interfaith leaders, and funders who are advancing gender justice and bringing a faith lens to this work. I will acknowledge that Eid begins tonight, and so we regret that we do not have a representative of the Muslim faith with us today. So I'm going to just begin with brief introductions of our panelists. and then invite each of them to offer a brief statement about the work they're doing, the analysis that they're bringing to this issue, and the hope and the commitments that they brought for all of us today. I'm going to do this in the order I see you all. This is the Reverend Jennifer Butler, who is a faith leader and a democracy strategist, the founder of Faith and Democracy, and author of Born Again, The Christian Right Globalized. If you want to learn more about how all of this has happened, I highly recommend this work to you. Previously, Jennifer helped found Faith in Public Life and served as a Presbyterian Church representative to the United Nations. Bishop Joseph Tolton is the founder and president of Interconnected Justice, an organization uniting global justice, racial justice movements connecting the African continent and its diaspora. He also serves as bishop of Global Ministries for the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. Vrinda Jagota is the New York City advocacy organizer at Hindus for Human Rights. Also, she is a journalist whose work centers South Asian diaspora communities and culture. Katherine, I'm still in the right order, is ACT Alliance representative to the United Nations with over 15 years of experience in international development, human rights, and partnerships with faith-based organizations across the UN system. And each of our panelists will share a little more about the organizations that they represent. And finally, Shari Turitz is the Vice President of Programs at American Jewish World Service, where she leads grant making, strategy, and advocacy rooted in Jewish values of justice and human dignity. Shari brings over 2 decades of human rights experience to HJWS in their important work around the world. So we're going to start with you, and I'm thinking to Jennifer. Please help me welcome Jennifer.
Thanks so much. This is amazing to be sitting here and be sitting here in this building with these amazing, incredible colleagues. Just to tell a few stories about this building to ground us and to start where Mary Katherine Morn did. This building, you may have noticed, is called the Church Center for the UN. And this building is here because United Methodist Women, who were a global force to be reckoned with in the early part of the 20th century, had the vision when this land over here was just a meatpacking district, just an industrial area, but it was claimed for the United Nations post World War II. And they had the vision to build a building here, saying that the world's faith traditions would want to have a front row seat to the UN, to shaping the UN. And they organized along with other faith traditions to ensure that the UN was successful. And if you've been in the chapel, of course, on the ground floor, it's an interfaith chapel. Right? This is actually the chapel where I was ordained to be a Presbyterian minister. And it was in that chapel that I was inspired by Muslim women to claim my ordination rather than walk away from my faith. I had become so disillusioned by the abuse of faith, by the injustices I saw and the hypocrisy I saw in my own tradition. As I watched Muslim women claim their voices, I told myself, if they can do that with all they're up against, I sure as hell can too. And so I got ordained in that chapel, and my church, which was based in New Jersey, took a busload of people up here to watch that, to participate in that ordination. So this is the power of faith. This is the true vision of faith. And yeah, what we're up against today is a powerful movement that seeks to undermine women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and much, much more, which I want to talk about, in the name of religion. And this is co-opted religion. This is manipulated religion. This isn't what faith traditions truly teach. But they have mounted a strategy since the year 2000, which was I happened to be here at the UN at that time, representing the Presbyterian Church at the UN. And they have built a powerful movement, not only lobbying at the UN, as we've seen this week, to roll back the progress made over the past couple of decades, but to advance a whole different mindset around how the world should be organized, to reorganize us around the lines of patriarchy and dominance of all kinds. And so I guess, so one of the things I want to say is that in addition to organizing here at the UN, their ultimate goal is actually to dismantle democracy itself around the globe. Right. This person will take my sweater off. I'm working up a sweat here, so I got a lot to say. And of course, we see that now as the United States has a full-blown Christian right movement that has a plan called Project 2025 that seeks to implement Christian nationalist teaching and patriarchal and racist domination within our national policies. And then in addition to that, they're exporting those viewpoints around the world. So we now not only have the United States is no longer a supporter of gender justice and democracy itself, they're actually a bad actor advancing illiberalism around the globe. And since over the past couple of decades, the anti-gender movement has built an infrastructure on every continent, in nearly every country, a cadre of groups that is working to dismantle gender justice, nation by nation, region by region. And then in addition to that, the United States has in its own national security strategy mainstreamed Christian nationalism through their security strategy. So rather than forming an alliance, continuing to have alliances with Europe, they're starting to form alliances with other autocratic countries like Russia. And the goal of all of that is to actually shift global geopolitics in favor of a coalition of autocrats that will actually undermine the UN, multilateral bodies, the human rights infrastructure, and bring down this kind of collaborative system that we built post-World War II. And so what do we do in the face of all of that? That's a lot for us to be up against. The key to this is, in our view, at Faith and Democracy, to build a global alliance of faith leaders that can advance, in the name of faith, advance gender equality, racial equality, and continue to make the case for democracy as rooted in our teachings around human dignity and human flourishing. Some of the struggles we've had in the past, I think, is that a lot of people in frustration at how religion has maneuvered in the past. A lot of times, people have rejected faith altogether. What's so important is that we begin to partner with faith to actually use our moral and theological voices to make the case very vocally against those that would use faith to dismantle human rights and democracy itself, and to build coalitions. Maybe to give one example of a region that is really struggling against this and making some headway. I've been talking a lot with Brazilians as part of our work, and we see that in Brazil, a long history actually of empires using religion for soft power. So the history in Brazil goes back a ways. The US CIA actually encouraged exportation of American evangelicalism to Brazil as a counterbalance against the social teachings of Catholic liberation theologians, right? And that changed the religious makeup of Brazil so that it was a third evangelical and much less Catholic. And so over time, the evangelical population grew and was very influenced by a conservative expression of evangelicalism. It was very much against liberation theology and women's rights and more autocratic friendly. And of course, that movement went on to support Bolsonaro, who recently ruled the country, but was ousted in an election. And the US collaborated with Bolsonaro's supporters to have a coup that was very similar to the coup that we saw here in the United States, again, led by religious evangelicals and Pentecostals. And so we see those synergies there. And at the same time, Brazil is also reclaiming faith to advance a democratic movement in the country. And so progressive religious people and evangelicals themselves are organizing a counter voice against Bolsonaro and his autocratic party and regime. In fact, some of the evangelicals in that country told me how recently they have gotten a radio program that is broadcast nationwide to make the progressive case for evangelicalism for democracy. So they're organizing to reclaim faith for justice against a very long tradition in Brazil that not only stems from the CIA in the 70s and 80s, but also goes back to American slavery, which the slaveholder religion was actually also exported there. So I guess what I urge us to do today is to continue to build a movement of faith-based democracy defenders around the globe to reclaim faith for justice and for democracy and for gender equality everywhere around the world.
Mr. Tolton, I failed to say that we're asking each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes. And would you say a little bit about, as Jennifer did, what your organization is organized around and how that, the particular perspective you bring to the question? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be with each one of you. And I'm so glad to be with my fellow panelists. I always learn much when I hear from Reverend Jennifer Butler, so thank you so much. And to UUSC, AJWS, the Dolan Fund, and Faith and Democracy, thank you. I'm intrigued by this idea of Judith Butler's around the patriarchal restoration agenda. My organization, Interconnected Justice, is certainly very focused on this agenda, but we see this agenda through the lens of race and through the lens of economics and through the lens of human sexuality. And in particular, the work that I do in Interconnected Justice is building infrastructure, co-joined infrastructure between Africans and African Americans to collectively reveal and expose and ultimately supplant the political infrastructure imprint and policy implications of the religious right as it impacts people of African descent in these two theaters, the African American and African context. So let me begin not with an analysis of policy, but with a review of history. In the 1400s, the Pope drafted the Doctrine of Discovery, a theological claim which articulated that Christian nations not only had the right, but more importantly, a divine mandate to take land, extract resources, and dominate pagans or non-Christians. And this was not simply a religious idea, but it was the spiritual architecture of anti-Blackness that has endured even unto this day. It was a fusion of religious imperialism and economic ambition, where faith was used to sanctify conquest, and Black bodies were turned into instruments of labor and wealth. That relationship between Christianity and economic domination has never disappeared. And although it has been routinely challenged, it has only evolved. After the Civil War in the United States, Reconstruction opened a brief moment and a radical possibility. Multiracial democracy, reimagined political order, and a glimpse of what justice could look like. But that moment was overturned very violently. And in its place, a corrupt political theology emerged or reemerged, one that I personally call Confederate Christianity, a faith that sanctified segregation, it baptized racial hierarchy, and it chose order over justice. And I'm going to go off script for a moment here, because I think that this idea of choosing order over justice is very relevant to our current moment, because we have a question to ask. Are we going to choose to heal with MAGA and the anti-gender movement, or are we going to cripple them, hold them accountable? All right, let's just keep that question in mind. That theology held power for generations until it was confronted by the liberative gospel of the civil rights movement, a movement where Black faith leaders reimagined and reclaimed Christianity as a force for dignity, democracy, and human rights. And the drumbeats of Easter were heard as a liberative opportunity and not a regressive force. But that rebuke was not accepted. It has been continuously resisted, and over time, Confederate Christianity has reorganized, giving birth to the modern-day ultra-conservative religious right. So what we're witnessing today, particularly through the rise of the global anti-gender movement, is not new. And I think it's really important that we recognize this, because sometimes I think that we marvel at the problem and we marvel at their execution, when in fact, they are basically going back to tried and true formulas of oppression and repackaging them. The packaging is sparkling, but the product is old and stale. Now, here is where the analysis has to deepen a bit, because this movement did not grow randomly. It was built strategically with a domestic and a global vision. In the United States, by the late 20th century, society was becoming secularly social, more socially secular rather. And at that same time, the world was becoming more interconnected. When President Nixon went to China, he not only opened economic relations, but it marked a major geopolitical shift. It was the beginning of a new era of global interdependence. Economies were becoming linked, politics were becoming transnational, and ideas were now traveling faster than ever before. The religious right understood something critical. If the world is interconnected, then power must be organized in an interconnected fashion. So they built. Domestically, they constructed a movement rooted in religious nationalism, focused on controlling the courts, focused on manipulating legislation and driving punitive and extreme narratives. We see that today in efforts like the SAVE Act, in the continued erosion of the Voting Rights Act. We know what the Supreme Court is about to do, and in the broader attempt to redefine democracy itself. But simultaneously, as they built a domestic agenda, they also built global infrastructure, with Africa being their headquarters. They invested in relationships across the African continent. They funded networks, they trained leaders, they exported ideology, particularly around gender and sexuality. And a partnership, an enduring partnership emerged. It was quiet, it's been strategic, and it has been mutually reinforcing. In several African contexts, political leaders seeking stability, legitimacy, and control found in American religious actors a powerful ally. And the exchange was clear. State power would secure resources and enforce order. Religious networks would shape culture, influence law, and define morality. And this is one of the most uninterrogated truths of the global anti-gender movement. To Reverend Mary Katherine's point, it is not simply about gender. It is about governance. It is about who gets to define the moral and political future of nations. So when we see the anti-gay bills in Senegal and Ghana, we must understand that it is not only national policies that we should stay out of because we should not meddle, but it is a part of a transnational ideological ecosystem. What's going on in Ghana is as much our business as it is the citizens. When we see the continued extraction of resources from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we know that 250,000 Black women have lost their job in Trump too, we must ask how political power, economic interest, and religious influence intersect. Because the story in the Congo and the loss of jobs for Black women in particular, the largest bloc of voters who have consistently voted against Trump, one of the only two blocs of voters that he did not gain voters with. There were two blocs, Black women and Jewish. When we see the erosion of Black political power in the United States, we must recognize that it is connected to a broader effort to weaken Black agency globally. Because anti-Blackness is not local, it is global in design. And therefore, the response must also be global. And this is where Black internationalism becomes essential. Black internationalism is not just about solidarity, it is analysis. It is the recognition that the conditions facing Black people in the United States, in Haiti, in Africa, and across the diaspora are not isolated, they are interconnected. It is the understanding that the same forces that restrict voting rights in America are often aligned with those that restrict human rights in Africa. The same ideologies that challenge gender justice in one context are exported to another. The same economic systems that extract from Africa shape the conditions of Black life globally. And so our response must be equally interconnected. In interconnected justice, we are building and working toward that response. We convene clergy and youth and and elders across borders. We are grounding our work not in domination, but in African cosmologies that teach us that life is relational, that dignity is collective, and that justice is necessary for the health of the whole. And we are seeking to build infrastructure to identify, analyze, rebuke, and ultimately supplant the reach of white Christian nationalism globally. Because this is not simply a moment of resistance, it should be a moment of reconstruction. We are being called to rebuild a moral framework, political imagination, and a global movement where faith is no longer weaponized against the vulnerable, but mobilized in the service of dignity, equality, and human flourishing. And let me close with this. If the architects of domination have learned to think globally, if the architects of domination have figured out how to move resources across borders and ideology and power, then so must we. We must become just as interconnected, but rooted in justice, just as strategic, but grounded in dignity, just as global, but committed to equity, because we are already connected across oceans, histories, and struggles. The only question for us is whether we will organize and operationalize that connection into power. And I am here today because I believe that we will. Thank you so kindly.
Whole history lesson in that speech. That was amazing. Thank you both. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Vrinda, and I'm the New York City organizer at Industry Human Rights. And we are an organization that's dedicated to fighting internationalism and caste-based discrimination in South Asia and in the diaspora. We similarly kind of see what's happening in the diaspora is very much connected to what's happening in South Asia. We see also, and I personally and our organization really believes that all struggles are kind of interconnected, which I'll get into in a bit. But my work specifically involves chapter building, advocating for progressive policy like an anti-caste-based discrimination bill here in New York. Cultural programming, like as I mentioned, I'm a music journalist as well as an organizer, so I like to do like music shows, and I found through a lot of my organizing, you know, you bring people in with music and food, and then they're there and they'll stay there, and then you get them to kind of to learn about the policy and the what's going on. And we do screenings of films like Homebound, Know Your Rights trainings for immigrants combating and targeted by ICE, and advocacy work to end mass incarceration. Thank you so much for having me here. It is very meaningful to be in this room, which represents decades kind of spent cultivating a global consensus on dignity, rights, and justice. And it feels especially meaningful because as we all know, we are living in a moment where those ideas are under very controlled and coordinated attack across countries and religions and political systems. We are seeing a fascist tidal wave of politics and ideology that names itself as moral clarity and tradition and faith, but actually operates as a means of control. So the way I think about this is that faith is not inherently liberatory, but it's also not inherently oppressive. It is terrain, and that terrain is currently being fought over. And in my work with human rights, I've seen how narratives kind of travel across that terrain. The same language that shows up in legislation in India, the language of protecting culture or family values or threats to social order, that echoes here in the diaspora as well. It shows up everywhere from WhatsApp forwards to conversations you hear in passing in the temple, but then also concretely in lobbying efforts and in school board meetings and in legislation. And it's not often framed as exclusion, it's framed as preservation, which is what makes this moment so complex, because anti-gender movements are not just about policy, but they're also about that storytelling. And that storytelling kind of positions gender justice as foreign, queerness as an imposition, women's autonomy as destabilizing, and equality itself as a kind of threat. So then the question kind of becomes, what do you organize? How do you organize within faith traditions in this moment where you see this happening? And for me, that begins with refusing a false choice that says you can either have faith or gender justice. I think that the Hindu traditions that I come from, like every kind of faith tradition, isn't static. They do contain tools for hierarchy, but also theology of liberation. And they have been used to justify oppression, but they can also be used to dismantle it. So part of our work is that excavation. So we kind of asked ourselves, what is the ethical framework within our traditions that align with the concepts of dignity, autonomy, and freedom? For example, in Hindu philosophy, there are some concepts like dharma, which is not just duty, but a kind of ethical alignment towards justice. Ahimsa, which is not just nonviolence, but a refusal to harm in thought, word, and structure. And to me, I think of that as also a duty to combat normalized violence, normalized state violence. And we also talk about Shakti, which is not just abstract feminine power, but a kind of force that disrupts and transforms. So to me, those aren't just kind of metaphors in the sky, those are organizational tools. Something I've learned a lot through this job is, honestly, before I started, many people like myself who were raised Hindu grew up feeling very alienated from the faith because it's been used as a tool for marginalization. And so I found myself very much feeling like, how do I even have a kind of relationship with this faith? But something I've learned through this job is that, as I'm saying, these concepts carry a lot of weight because they mean so much to so many people, the majority of whom are not using them as tools of repression. So they carry very real weight. And also something I found among people who have faith is that they have a sense of hope. And I think that hope is necessary in moments that like what we're in right now. So those are two learnings of mine as someone who came to this as a person who's wasn't very religious and felt very conflicted about it. But I felt that religion is an extremely important tool for these reasons. So concretely, in our work, we do something called Big Texts for Liberation. There are a series of virtual seminars where everyone from priests and priestesses to academics to yoga instructors to more community members kind of come, and they share space for kind of critical discussion and exploration of what it would mean to have a truly liberatory and justice-oriented Hinduism. Our September Baitak honored Shakti, which I mentioned before, the kind of divine feminine power that creates and transforms the universe. Our June Baitak celebrated queerness and gender expansive expression in Hindu thought and in Hindu theology. And another central part of our work is relational. So that means sitting with people you don't agree with, challenging institutions that would prefer you be silent, and kind of sitting with and navigating your own contradictions. One thing we think a lot about is kind of confronting how identity gets mobilized in the diaspora. Many of us are part of communities that have experienced racism and exclusion, and that is a very real experience. But that identity can also be mobilized specifically talking about privileged Hindu Americans in America in harmful ways. We're seeing a lot, increasingly, the language of minority rights being used to shield regressive politics. Again, specifically talking about Hindus, who will say this is who we are, this is our culture, this is our faith, and will position a critique specifically around gender or caste, how the faith has used to marginalize people based on those identities as discrimination. We see that in legislation outlined any critique of the caste system as inherently Hindu-phobic, for example. So part of our faith-based organizing for gender justice is about that discernment, and being able to say that not everything that is part of our tradition is sacred, and not everything that's uncomfortable is unjust. So that's a really big part of it. But then also part of that relational work is building relationships across difference. So holding those two realities, like having that true discernment and speaking, and also doing a lot of work with people who are different. And a lot of that work also is interfaith. So we host many gatherings. For example, we did like a Diwali and Bandi Chor Divas event at a church in Harlem, and spring celebration last year, and also this coming year in Richmond Hill for Hindu Sikh kind of unity. At these events, we bring people together who might otherwise not be in the same room, and create spaces where they can kind of share their stories and be honest with each other. And we also make a really big effort to platform female and queer musicians and panelists and activists in these spaces. And here's a kind of specific reason why that interfaith community is so important. So in Hindu nationalist spaces, there is this very kind of disgusting and systemic in legislation ideology colloquially referred to as love jihad. And the concept is that Muslim men are predatory towards Hindu women whom they want to convert to Islam. And it's obviously false rhetoric that kind of uses Hindu women's like perceived purity to oppress Muslim men and also paint Muslim women as oppositionally impure. And as progressive Hindus, it's our job to learn from our Muslim peers about how Hindu nationalism is being used in these ways and to do what we can to combat it and to speak to members of our community about why this isn't real, why we need to fight this ourselves. And that fight starts with that kind of honest discourse, like, you know, and community building. Last summer, Mayor Adams was planning to meet with a woman named Kajal Hindustani, who is a known Hindu nationalist who espouses many of these hateful ideologies, including love jihad, concept of love jihad. We organized a press conference on the steps of City Hall, calling on our interfaith partners to come and speak out against this decision. And our organizing worked. Mayor Adams didn't take the meeting. And the reason we were able to pull that together so quickly, you know, we found out this was happening on a Monday, we had the press conference on a Wednesday. And the reason we could do that is because of the strength of our networks and the power of our relationship building, which is the kind of thing that happens slowly and intentionally over time, over shared meals, over conversation. So the real human connection is what leads to the ability to organize quickly. So what is our strategy in this kind of context? I thought I'd share a few things that we've learned. The first is to reclaim language. Words like family, tradition, and faith don't just belong to anti-gender movements. We have to tell the fuller story of what they mean. Family can mean care beyond biology, tradition can mean evolution, and faith can mean courage in the face of injustice. Second, as I've been saying, it's very important to build across difference because, as you just mentioned, forces that we're up against are coordinated and therefore our response has to be too. And interfaith and intercultural work can't just be symbolic, it has to be strategic. For example, I am very inspired by the Black Christian activists during the Civil Rights Movement. I just went to Selma, Alabama through Hindu Human Rights to attend the bridge crossing to commemorate Bloody Sunday 61 years ago. I personally see my life here as an immigrant and as a brown person in the US as directly indebted to the work of those faith activists. And since traveling to Selma and learning about the case of, I don't know if you've all heard of the case of Sonny Burton, who was on death row for a crime he didn't commit. I have, and Hindu Human Rights, become very activated to work on ending the End Rikers campaign. We've been working on that, but I have done more and kind of also ending the death penalty because we believe that the state shouldn't have the option to kill its own citizens, especially in a history with a country with a history like a legacy of slavery. That is going to be part of the kind of justice system, and it is part of the justice system to this day. So I worked on advocacy for Sonny's case, and I'm starting up a kind of bi-weekly phone bank to advocate for other incarcerated people. And I see this as a gender-related issue because women and queer people often don't get gender-affirming care when they're incarcerated. 75% of women incarcerated are mothers and primary caretakers of their children and families. So their absence is a trauma for the extended community as well. Yeah. And their separation from their children is, to me, a reproductive rights issue as well. Every person deserves the right to give birth and to feel that they'll have a kind of safe future. And I think mass incarceration denies that of everyone. Oh, sure. Okay. The third lesson is to center the most impacted women, queer, trans people, gender non-conforming people. And I just want to end with something that sits at the intersection of my work as an organizer and a writer, because both are kind of about attention, about what we choose to see and amplify. Okay, yeah, so we're living in a moment where certain stories are being told, those kinds of stories of threat and decline, but our work is not just to counter those stories, but to expand the frame, to tell stories that are just as true but less amplified, the stories of solidarity across faith, of resistance and of choosing dignity over dogma. So the stories that we bring into focus don't just describe the world, they shape what people learn to recognize as possible. And in moments like that, moments like this, that is strategy and this faith dimension. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm here representing the ACT Alliance. ACT is a coalition of churches. We have 153 churches and church-related organizations working across all continents in 120 countries. We do humanitarian work, we do development, we do advocacy. And I'm the representative of the organization here at the United Nations in New York. So for ACT Alliance, gender justice and gender equality is a key area of work. In fact, we have a wealth of expertise in it. Our gender justice program works on transformative faith-based methodologies that bring together human rights and faith. We also play the role of a convener in interfaith and intrafaith and interfaith manner to gather collective knowledge and to gather lessons learned. As, for example, is exemplified by two publications that we did for the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the ICPD Program of Action. So these publications were really looking at lessons learned and concrete examples, for example, in the past 30 years of the contributions of faith communities to the implementation of these agreements. So in terms of examples of what we do, I will have a couple of local examples. The ACT Brazil Ecumenical Forum implemented a collaboration on gender and fundamentalism. And basically there were a series of dialogues and convenings between women, between children, elderly people, LGBTQI plus people, people with disabilities. And all of them really confirmed how violence was present in their daily experience and how very often this violence was unfortunately articulated along religious arguments and with biblical citations that were very often taken out of context. Another example is how Norwegian Church Aid, also one of our members, what the work that they did in Nigeria and in South Sudan, developing a toolkit on comprehensive sexuality education and rolling it out with parents and with teachers. So this really helped develop the dialogue and improve the dialogue between parents and children, and as a result there was a significant reduction in teenage pregnancies. So but lately we have embarked in a somewhat different and bigger picture, a new way of looking at this, in particular through what we call the crossroads of extremism, which is a new initiative that is looking at the convergence between the far right, the religious fundamentalism, and national authoritarian nationalism. So we see these things, of course, as converging, and we see how they are undermining human rights, they are polarizing society, they are eroding trust in democratic institutions, and they are, and of course, all this is linked to the shrinking of the civic space. So this initiative has three objectives. The first one is deepen our understanding. We want to be able to map actors. We want to be able to monitor this information and to really analyze dynamics of power. The second objective is to strengthen our own capacity, the capacity of our members of our communities to co-create alternative narratives, to increase their capacity in digital media, in digital and media literacy and advocacy skills. And the third objective is to mobilize a global network. So ultimately building those cross-regional and cross-sectoral alliances that we just heard about. So in the framework of this initiative, we conducted consultations among our members, first of all, both in the Global North and Global South. And I would like to share some of the outcomes of this consultations. So in terms of analysis of the context, and the interesting thing was that, of course, there were many similarities that we found even in very, very different contexts. So in terms of analysis of the context, first of all, erosion of trust and manipulation. So we are experiencing how the frustration of people that comes from inequalities, from economic injustice, from lack of social security, etc. All this frustration is being manipulated and is being redirected against migrants, against minorities, fueling xenophobia and isolationism. The second characteristic is the shrinking of the space, or the absence of the space for real dialogue. So we see that the nuanced dialogue is not possible anymore between people who don't agree 100% with each other, and that any dissent is very quickly labeled as anti-family or anti-Semitic or anti-something. And disturbingly, churches are retreating. They're not really engaging in this public discourse. They're more retreating to the personal sphere, and instead of addressing systemic justice issues. The other characteristic is the polarization and above all the normalization of violence. So we are seeing hate speech that is common, and of course social media play like an echo chamber for that. And this is compounded by the use of apocalyptic framing, like we are under attack, we are under war, we need to protect ourselves. And all this ultimately ends up normalizing violence against minority, against LGBTQI people, etc. And as we have heard very eloquently before, of course, this is a trend, and since 2000, we have been experiencing sustained attack against gender and feminist movements. And of course, this is very much linked to the shrinking of the civic space. Once again, we have just witnessed it here. I am here speaking. A lot of colleagues of mine are not, because they were not allowed, because of visa, because of this, because of that. So this was more the framing of the problem. In terms of strategies for faith-based action, there were a few learnings that I would like to share with you. The first strategy is to rebuild this trust that was eroded, rebuild social cohesion, and faith actors are of course very well placed to do that, if not us, whom. So building these safe spaces for dialogue once again. The second point was to reaffirm justice-based narratives. So, in other words, do counter narratives, develop counter narratives and other arguments that are based in theology, theological interpretations. So, once again, faith leaders in particular are have a key role in that. The third strategy was to model inclusion, so ordain women pastors, affirm LGBTQI plus participation. The fourth strategy is to build coalitions, as we said, and in order to try to move the movable middle and go beyond traditional actors. And the fourth strategy was to share knowledge and build our own capacities. And this should be based, of course, in evidence-based solutions. So in order to walk the talk of building cross-sectoral alliances, ACT Alliance has just embarked in a new initiative that aims to be innovative, and that is with other partners, with the Baha'i community, but also with the feminist organizations like FOS Feminista, and with the United Nations, like the UN Women. This coalition is called Faith, Gender and Human Rights in Action. And the first thing that we did was to convene some regional dialogues. And During last week, during the first week of CSW, we have convened partners for a moment of reflection and sharing of mutual learning. So I would like to share a few lessons that were shared from different parts of the world, because I was also asked not to only to bring the experience of ACT Alliance, but also that of partners. So that's what I'm trying to do now. In the Middle East, we have heard from Musawa, an organization, rights-based Muslim organization, how they are working on reinterpreting Islamic texts based on human rights, and so to really demonstrate that human rights and Islam are not in contradiction with one another. So this was one strategy, and the other one was once again to build coalition with feminist organizations. So we have heard from them how the combination of these two strategies together, they are really working. In Latin America, we heard from Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir how they are working within communities on abortion, and they are using the framework and the concept of abundant life. So based on the idea that to defend life means to defend the conditions that make life possible. So having a life that has dignity, a life that has a job, health, security, etc. In Africa, we have heard from our partners, Jean Soggi, how they are engaging parents of LGBTQI plus people, analyzing the relationship with their children in light of their faith, because they understand that family does matter. And other strategies that were shared in that space included the need to enter the space of political organizing as opposed to just the one of civil society education, where we are more comfortable and talking to one another. The need to be more technologically savvy, because of course we know that social media plays a big role, and certain forces are very well versed in it. And the need to work with the parliamentarians and judges so they are less easily captured by or attracted by anti-rights narratives. It is also worth noting that a massive constraint that we heard across regions and partners is the lack of funding. So on top of course, the crisis of funding that all civil societies across the spectrum are experiencing, faith-based actors have one more obstacle, that is the reluctance, very often, if not the fear, to fund religion. So this, I just wanted to share some of the learnings that we had through our own experience and that our partners. I do think that, of course, the challenge is enormous, but I also think that we have a moral duty to act, and that we should do it not only with the enthusiasm and the determination and passion that characterizes us, but also with the political savviness and the willingness to build bridges across sectors. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is it all good? Yeah. Thank you, Mary Katherine and UUSC for organizing the panel. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you all, especially since I just came yesterday from lobbying on the Hill with some of our clergy leadership around some really critical gender justice issues. And as you can imagine, doing that work today, very different from when I started at HWS doing that work in 2013. So it's just great to be here with you. As many of you might know, HAWS was formed with a very specific mandate so that people who identify as Jewish could direct their philanthropy outward, beyond the Jewish community, beyond the United States, towards marginalized groups in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And today, HAWS is one of the largest Jewish organizations who are dedicated to defending human rights and fighting poverty around the world. So we're 40 years old, and really thinking about what you had to say, Bishop, about our need to move money to counter the anti-gender movement. And this is something that HAWS has really been dedicated to for those 40 years. We have invested more than $500 million in grassroots organizations fighting for adolescent girls, Indigenous farmers and fisher folk, LGBTQI communities, and democratic movements really across the global South. And as Mary Katherine started today, we are all, many of our religions really rooted in this theological idea of what in Hebrew is called B'Tselem Elohim, or which translates into in the image of God. So this idea of every human being being created in the divine image, and therefore needing dignity, respect, and freedom. This is really a very core principle for us at AJWS. And what I thought I would do was really point out it can get very depressing to do this work around the world, and but there are examples where we are actually finding that the social movement ecosystem work actually works. So I wanted to focus on a couple of those examples, but first, just to talk for a minute about how we work at AJWS. We employ a model that we call the grants multiplier model. So that includes grant making. We have over 500 partners across the 14 countries where we work, and we're a long-term, very flexible funder. We do accompaniment work. So in every country where we are working, we have folks on the ground who are partners, mentors, allies, work in solidarity with those grantee partners on the ground. And of course, as I said, started with, we do advocacy. So we believe it is our responsibility to also pressure our own government officials to every day, as hard as it is, align U.S. foreign policy with the human rights agenda. Obviously, we're much more focused on a do no harm agenda these days, but we find that it's still really important to do that. So what we feel is that combining these three approaches in a faith voice can really make a difference. So I'm going to talk about two examples where we've seen this happen recently, which builds on so many of the themes that my amazing colleagues here have brought up. One is work we do in Kenya supporting 11 organizations working to advance LGBTQ rights in that country. And I want to call out that Jagota is here from Jintiango, who's one of the most amazing organizations on the continent. So I feel strange talking about this with her here, but she can maybe add some when I finish. But the 11 organizations we support there have been working in the shadow of an anti-gay bill, which is modeled very much after the nightmare law that many of you have, I'm sure, heard about, the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda. But last May, something really unusual happened, and I'm sure Lexi was centered in that. So soon after the Trump administration started dismantling the human rights infrastructure here in the US, global conservative leaders, this transnational piece that you also were talking so much about, organized a gathering called the Pan-African Conference on Family Values. It was backed by the American far right. The conference aimed to frame the very existence of LGBTQI plus people as a Western intrusion on African society. And despite the fact that they called it a Pan-African conference, the original list of speakers had not one African person who was supposed to speak. So that's where things get interesting, right? They chose to hold the conference in Nairobi, one of the countries with one of the most incredibly active queer rights movements in the world. And they organized to counter this, this conference with our support and the support of others, I'm sure. Local grassroots groups mobilized to expose that neo-colonial agenda. And they organized protests, they wrote op-eds, they sent very angry letters to the Kenyan Red Cross, which they had found out from their research was actually the owner of the hotel where the conference was happening. They booked rooms in the hotel so that conference participants had to stay far from where the conference was going to happen. And although the conference ultimately took place, these activists managed to get inside the conference, disrupt sessions, and do some really beautiful old style organizing. And their resistance amplified the voices and targeted this whole campaign caught the eye of the media. There were stories in The Guardian and Al Jazeera. And even Kenyan's evangelical president, William Ruto, at the end of the day had to distance himself from what became really a disgraceful display of imperialism. And one of the most promising signs from our perspective of the success of all of this organizing was that the so-called Family Values Bill, modeled on the Ugandan law, has not even been brought to Parliament for a vote. So months later, we continue to stand with that collection of amazing LGBT organizations and their movements. There'll be an election next year in 2027, and we just decided to do some significant funding to 3 longstanding partners for an initiative called Queering the Vote, which is about getting to the polls that very significant and sizable community to show up, they and their allies to show up for that vote and make sure that they make sure that their voices are heard. Clearing the ballot. Clearing the ballot, yes, excuse me, sorry. Another example is from DC, and this could be also, hopefully you've heard about it and read about it. There was this terrible human named Jeremy Carl, who's really a minor figure on the conservative right, and he was nominated recently to be the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. So that is the role, like the most senior person in the State Department interacting with international organizations for the United States. So it would affect human rights, climate, global health development. Because we have this advocacy team in DC that works really closely with the Sexual Health and Rights Coalition that the bishop is also working with, we knew that Carl worked at the Heritage Foundation and was deeply, deeply unqualified for this role. We also knew that as soon as his nomination came forth, he deleted hundreds of social media posts, which of course these days is a smoking gun for knowing that something really awful must be there. So our team and the team actually that the bishop is also affiliated with spent untold hours reviewing all the podcast appearances that Jeremy Carl had had in the recent past, in places where he had promoted white nationalist ideology, the Great Replacement theory, anti-Semitic, homophobic, and racist comments. And as with many figures in this administration, he showed absolutely no remorse for all of the things that he had said. And as this confirmation hearing approached, we mobilized our faith community to alert both the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the media that Carl was completely unfit to take up this role. So our staff created a dossier built on all of these podcasts that sadly they had to listen to, and shared them with both Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We made sure that every Democrat showed up for the hearing, because you may not know, but our representatives often don't show up for these hearings. And we also knew that just targeting Democrats wasn't going to be enough, because with just Democrats, he would certainly be confirmed, as we're seeing today with our new horrendous head of Department of Homeland Security. So we focused on 2 persuadable Republicans, Republican Dave McCormick from Pennsylvania and John Curtis of Utah. And the campaign with John Curtis was especially strong. We reached out to our 1,200 rabbi and clergy networks and religious leaders, both in Utah and outside of Utah. Some rabbis that we work with alerted their congregations, who then reached out to their senators. We placed an op-ed co-written by a rabbi who's on our staff in the Deseret News, which we knew John Curtis read, which is a Utah newspaper. And then we went broader. We went out to our 75,000 individuals in our membership network of the AJWS Action Network. We had 2,000 people respond and organize to call their representatives to share that they felt that this person was completely unfit. About an hour after the hearing on the 5th, which is great theater and actually worth watching if you want to have some faith in the Democratic Party and some of our leaders, but about 2 hours after the hearing ended, Senator Curtis said that he could not, in good faith, actually vote for this nominee. And just last week, Jeremy Carl tweeted that he was withdrawing his appointment, his potential appointment. So an incredible win, yeah. Wow. A great partnership between the Council on Global Equality and HWS. So just to conclude conclude, I think the example really illustrates something larger than the power of our faith-based voice on gender justice. It reveals how important it is to use faith and the Jewish moral lens in this particular case to counter those who misuse religion, to divide, to scapegoat, to persecute sexual minorities. And the irony in Kenya was quite striking, right? The hatred was actually the Western import. Yeah. It came straight from hard right evangelicals in the US. And many organizations like AJWS and all of my esteemed colleagues here, and probably many of you in the audience, we have the responsibility to reclaim that mantle of faith, to show that faith can advance dignity and access and acceptance rather than fear and exclusion. And our support for the movements that embrace sexual and gender diversity demonstrate really something very powerful for us, which is that faith can actually be part of the cure. It doesn't have to be part of the illness.
So grateful for these wonderful panelists who bring such a wide range of experience and perspective, history, organizing, theology, storytelling, advocacy. I feel moved by the idea that hearts and minds can be moved and changed. Maybe not the hearts and minds of tech billionaires who are part of the problem, and maybe not the hearts and minds of autocrats who are practicing this incredibly cynical art of grabbing and consolidating power. But all of us, I think, are talking about other hearts and minds. So I want to just kind of set aside the cynical autocrats and the tech billionaires, the oligarchs, and ask you, where do you see the threads coming together among the people who are feeling so much fear in many different contexts for many different reasons, experiencing intersectional challenges in their own lives? So where do you find the common threads among the people who are feeling fear and following the right? And where are you finding the common threads that we can weave together, which is what I heard so powerfully, is the potential of this global network to come together and be a real agent for change. What are those common threads? Hearts and minds.
I'll say just very briefly that what I am paying the most attention to and what has really spoken to me is the organizing to combat ICE throughout the country. Obviously, they're here. ICE is, acting in really, it's a crisis, and they're acting in completely inhumane ways, and it's very demoralizing. And my friends who are vulnerable to ICE are scared every day. And also the organizing I've seen, and in moments like this, you just have to remember that the people united won't be defeated. Those things that you say. And I think that we are seeing that though. We are seeing people, mobilizing and saying, okay, who's gonna do ICE Watch outside this event where we got a call that ICE might come? Who's gonna I'm in a million Signal chats where someone's like, okay, I'm gonna drop off my kid at daycare, then I'm on the way. People are very mobilized, and people are passionate and organized. They have the structures in place. I think that's something that's been really inspiring. Thanks.
I will echo that. I'm very proud to be a faith leader. I'm saying this to Jennifer earlier, particularly based on the witness coming out of bullets. And I think it's important to honor the fact that the Catholic Church at the highest levels kind of issued statements and thoughts that really did provoke a response from a grassroots group of faith leaders who then came in as the boots on the ground. And that got very connected, of course, to the grassroots activists on the ground who are using digital platforms and all sorts of other possible ways to lift up their voice. And so, although that might not have been schemed out intentionally, it certainly did come together And I do think that that's a methodology that we might want to replicate. How do we use the voice of senior faith leaders to provide direction and inspiration? How do we then operationalize those kind of the boots on the ground community leaders to do the work that they do, and how can we then support that and amplify it through the work of grassroots folks who use digital platforms as points of advocacy. So I do want to kind of lift up that. I also would lift up that in the African American church, in the Black church, I think something very interesting is going on in that the church is trying to find its voice in this moment. And there's a lot of kind of internal wrangling between the new voices of the Black church who understand that this is a moment that speaks to an anti-gender movement that has real implications for how we understand human sexuality in the Black context. Will those voices be able to emerge as the dominant voices driving the social justice imperative of the Black church? Will they be able to free themselves from being captive by some of the more traditional, harder line, conservative African-American voices who unfortunately have been unknowingly conscripted into a white nationalist agenda? And that has happened through grooming, and I use that word intentionally, over many years. It's the same thing that happened in Brazil, where, to your point, we had Billy Graham going in many years ago to rebuke the work of liberation theologians throughout Latin America, particularly in Brazil, and to undo that movement and to create space now for what we've seen happen with the Pentecostals. So I want to lift up the way faith leaders are coming together in this moment. And I also want to lift up the action that's happening in the Black church. And I do hope that all of us will be a part of, in some way, shape, or form, encouraging and helping those voices in the Black church that are seeking to break through as progressive voices to become the dominant voices that come out of that space.
I'm glad we started with immigration and what's happening in the opposition there in Minneapolis, and so many parts of the country, actually, not all that are in the news, and the role that clergy have been playing in that. And they have been directly targeted. So I want to talk about that for a second. Sometimes you can know what's powerful by watching the right's response to something, right? And so there's like, you really see that. In Minneapolis, you know, the ICE ICE actually literally targeted clergy, hitting them in the head with pepper balls, right? Like they were, this wasn't like incidental or they're firing into the crowd, but these were clergy that were praying and they were shot, and then there was laughter, right? And so I think it shows how powerful those voices are in that moment, that they have to specifically go after those voices to silence them. And in the past, I've watched my colleagues, you know, a decade ago, sort of silence themselves, feeling like they shouldn't bring their faith voice to the public square. So if anything, we should look at what happened there and realize just how powerful we are. The other place you can see this is the impact of Bishop Marian Buddy's sermon to Trump, where she called for mercy. Very simple, basic faith value, right? She didn't go out and speak like a fiery sermon on social justice, and she could have. There's plenty to be said, but she called for mercy, right? And that concept went around the globe. I've talked to her since. She is in much demand globally to speak to those words and what that meant. And so I think the right, in some cases, is overreaching. We see that on immigration. And when basic concepts like mercy are being violated, that's a point of connection. Even if we don't fully agree politically, even if we don't agree on the solutions to mass migration around the world, even if we don't agree about reproductive rights or LGBTQ rights, we can center on dignity and mercy, non-discrimination. I've been able to work with conservatives on access to abortion and get folks to agree just on not criminalizing abortion, get at the root causes. So a lot of times it's concepts like mercy. The right now has a full-on assault on the concept of empathy. You're talking about toxic empathy, right? And we've seen these global battles between J.D. Vance and both popes. I mean, Vance keeps saying, misstepping and saying things that are theologically completely against the teachings of the church, and the popes aren't having it. You know, and that was around empathy as well. That was around empathy. Vance was trying to make a case for nationalism, saying, you know, that there's this kind of hierarchy of needs. First, you care for yourself, and then your family, and then maybe if you have energy, you care for other people in the rest of the world. And the Pope said, no, the love knows no borders. That was the whole point of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I love these very global, public theological debates that have been happening in the past year. And to me, it does represent our sort of getting it that we need to reclaim our faith voice for democracy in this movement. MAGA forces here were furious that Pope Leo was elected to be Pope, howling that. I mean, they just went wild on Twitter and, you know, trashing this Pope because he's a binational Pope. And because they hoped that in having the first US Pope, they actually thought that they would have the Catholic Church, just like they did during fascism, right? The Catholic Church bent over, and that's part of the reason they used gender, right? Because in using gender, the fascists were able to get the Catholic Church to come alongside. Mussolini and Hitler were able to get the church to come into the fold. This time that is not happening, right? So we've learned maybe some of the lessons of history. So I think where I see the common threads are in mercy and empathy and our ability, even if we disagree on policy, to point to that and to point to the fact that our faith traditions do call for democratic governance and to call foul, to really expose that what these folks are after in attacking gender and trying to scare people around trans issue is democracy itself. And the goal of that is resource extraction and wealth and power and economic exploitation, like was done in the Kenya example, right? So we need to expose that, get to the root of that, and pull people together around just very basic values.
I guess so many beautiful things have been said. The only thing that I would say in terms of common threads is that I think we need to be a hell of a lot more strategic. And we are in a hurricane, a tornado, a daily tornado of things that offend us and seem to be so against everything that is embedded in our faith traditions and our even our American values. So I think we need to be more strategic and we need to work hand in hand with one another. We've been in competition with one another quite a bit in the past. And I think it is a time to really lock arms, interfaith, interorganizational. I think if we talk about the Jeremy Carlwin, it really was the Council on Global Equality, American Jewish World Service, and one or two other organizations saying, this is one step too far. This person cannot represent the United States at the State Department at this high a level. And I think I'm in a lot more collaborative spaces than I've ever been in the philanthropic space. I think there's a lot of discussion about trying to understand what's going on and plan for the future. And I have been saying for over a year, we need to create our own Project 2025. Like, how do we create that meta space where we're sitting together and figuring out what's the faith angle, what's the human rights angle, what's the philanthropy angle and the development angle? Because when there are attacks on all of us, we don't do as good a job as we can, I think, about thinking about what are the one or two or three things that we must do together. So that's really the common thread for me, is to be strategic, pick a few things, work together, and I've seen it work. So.
Thank you, Shari. We have time for a few questions. I'm gonna call and if you'll speak loudly, then I'll repeat it.
Okay, so statement and then question. Statement is this: there's a reason why all of the religions have gone to Africa and out and around the world. And there was an accord that was made between certain religions at that time that they would not proselytize their parishioners. So rather than try and get the American parishioners and make them Presbyterian when they used to be Protestant, or Protestant and become Catholic, they said we will go out to the world and we will proselytize the world. And what many people are not understanding is the proselytization of the world now has taken a negative turn. But the basis for them to go out was always rotten. So until that basis has been dealt with, the whole premise of us going outside to Africa, South America, everywhere else will continue to be rotten because the basis for it being done was rotten. And for me, I don't believe in many of the things that are being said, but I do believe that we do need to have an interconnectedness between mercy, justice, and mercy, justice, and grace. And if we can get that out, I think that many of the things that others do not believe in or don't want to be a part of, they can be able to see mercy. They can see grace and they can see justice.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead. I didn't quite hear a question, so I'm going to
There-
go ahead.
Please go ahead, because I thought I was going to do a question and the question left me.
Thank you. You're leaving time for someone else. That's great.
Hi, I'm Brooke Harris. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy and Main Rep at the UN for the Temple of Understanding down on the 3rd floor in the Saracen building. This was just lovely. I just felt like it was a lovely stream of water for my soul. I've been at it for a long time and I want a recording of everything because I just let it wash over me. But I wanted to add that I think climate justice is a key thread. I think that part of the cynicism behind the billionaires is that they understand, as the American military does, the level of trouble that we're in with access to clean water and the changing climate. And also our grassroots people are looking at the weather going, in my bones, I know. So I want to just add that to the thread and beg in a way that actually this is a brilliant interfaith gathering, but that I would hope immediately from here we can consider a monthly or a bi-monthly Zoom event that would target perhaps one at a time each of our constituencies, but responding jointly is a very classic interfaith strategy. So never alone, but maybe, targeting each one. I feel that the horrifying impact of the negativity that's been coming at us all needs this, because the lying is so intense. And also because I think I'm pretty well informed, but I also learned a lot from all of you. So I'm asking for us to redress that immediately. And I'm so happy to step into it with you and also to work on bringing Religions for Peace into it, because they've got a Ending Gender Violence handbook that we'll be working on updating. So we know all these issues are in it together. So I'm not sure that's a question.
Thank you. Well, let me just say, thank you so much. And our organization, as Shari said, we're in common spaces more than ever. And next week, UUSC is actually facilitating with the support from Faith and Democracy and many others. And all of our groups will be participating in a conversation in Lisbon on democracy, gender justice, and faith, and how these converge for a better future. And we hope that that coming together, and particularly with an emphasis and a prioritizing of voices from the global South, so that the poison that is at the base of all of the organizing and all of the ideologies is exposed and doesn't get, its liberation at the cost of the truth of Christian imperialism, white nationalism, all of those poisonous ideologies that have brought us to this place. There are lots of hands in the room, and we're at our time, I'm afraid. And so I'm going to turn with apologies to Bishop Tolton, who raised his hand, and perhaps you have a brief way to help us close?
Sure. Well, thank you for that trust. But what I will say, and thank you for your comments. And one of the things that I don't think we explicitly spoke to, but all are reaching toward, is the ways in which an American capitalist system has spread globally. It is actually at the core root of all of this. And your comment about climate change took me there, because issues around the economic distortion, and if I can say it in Mondani terms, affordability, in terms of what's the common thread, like the common thread between folks in Nairobi and folks here in New York City and in Mexico and in Mumbai is affordability. Like, the global South is reeling from the implications of inflation carried over from COVID in ways that Americans can't even understand. And so that basic crisis of affordability and human dignity that is deeply connected to extraction, to corporatization of the world, I think is a common denominator that does tie together so much of all that we've said. It's important to make that direct.
And you told us we will.
And we will come together. And we will do this. Absolutely. I believe every 500 years, something happens. And we know that it was 500 years ago that we had the Reformation, right? And so we're ready now for another Reformation.